it's Julie Spencer, author of the Buxton Peak series. We are half part of the way into Buxton Peak, The Early Years, which is the prequel to my Buxton Peak series. And I hope that if you guys like these videos that you will give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel and share these on social media so that other people can enjoy them as well. Okay, Buxton Peak, The Early Years, Chapter 3, Fine Dining. "Are you seeing what I'm seeing?" Marty Hayworth asked his friend. They peered through the window between the sound room and the recording studio, watching the kids manipulate songs and try out different rhythms. His 4 students were oblivious to their audience. Jeremy nodded. "How old did you say they were?" "Ian just turned 15, and I'm pretty sure the rest of them are all about the same." Ian frequently paused to write something on a pad of paper and then pulled his guitar back onto his lap. He was clearly giving instructions to the others. They'd been at it since early Saturday morning, taking advantage of an empty school and a band instructor willing to let them into the building. They barely stopped to use the restroom and had not taken a break for lunch. "Order some pizza," Jeremy said. "We're going to be here for a while." Marty began to turn away, but he halted and looked down at his longtime friend. "Glad I called you?" "Worth the drive from London," Jeremy said, smiling up at Marty and raising his eyebrows. This could get interesting. "Oh, wow, what smells so good?" Ian looked up to see Mr. Hayworth walk in the door with a strange man who had 4 pizzas stacked on his arms. His tailored suit and polished shoes hinted the man was too professional to be a pizza delivery boy, but the other guys didn't seem to notice. They set their instruments aside. Each grabbed a box and headed over to the table, offering enthusiastic appreciation. Ian held back. He sensed there was more to this encounter than dinner. He was right. "Ian Taylor, I presume?" The man raised his eyebrows, already knowing the answer to his own question. He held the pizza out, halfway between them, inviting Ian to close the distance. "Are you hungry?" "You're American." Ian cautiously stood and reached for the box. Once the heat from the pizza flowed through the cardboard and the smell wafted up to his senses, Ian couldn't resist. He had a slice of pizza in his hand and half eaten before he could finish his thought, much less request an introduction. "Forgive my manners," the man nodded. "I'm Jeremy Walker. I'm a friend of Marty's. Sorry, Mr. Hayworth. And yes, I'm American." Ian swallowed the last bite of his first piece and narrowed his eyes at Jeremy. "What are you doing here?" "Not messing around, are you, Mr. Taylor?" Jeremy wandered through the instruments, ran his fingers along the hi-hat on the drum set, and not so inconspicuously glanced at Ian's notes. He didn't peruse them long enough to read anything, but looked back over at Ian with a knowing expression. "Mr. Hayworth invited me to hear you play." "You came all the way from America just to hear us play?" Ian couldn't hide the suspicion from his voice. "I live in London now." Jeremy pursed his lips and let his statement hang. "What do you do in London?" Ian leaned against the table behind him, his box left open and only the one piece missing. The other guys had forgotten their pizza temporarily. "I'm a manager." Jeremy glanced over at Mr. Hayworth, who was leaning against the wall, arms crossed and a smirk on his face. "Like of a business?" Ian asked. "More like of musicians." If a pin had dropped in the far corner of the building, they all would have heard it loud and clear. Jeremy wasn't here to deliver pizza, and he wasn't here to visit an old friend. Ian's breath deepened and his gaze returned to his teacher and mentor. "Did you invite him here?" "I did." Mr. Hayworth's head nodded slowly up and down. He pushed himself away from the wall and sauntered across the room. He stopped in front of Ian before looking him firmly in the eye. "Why don't we have some dinner, and you can tell Mr. Walker about your music?" "I am rather hungry." Ian raised his eyebrows. He glanced between his teacher and this new person in his life, took another piece from the box on the table, and lowered himself into a nearby chair. "Not without my mates." Ian shrugged out from underneath Jeremy's arm and pushed him away. The darkened hallway where they were taking a stroll hid Ian's frustration. "I'm not signing anything without them," he thought. They're not half as talented as you, Ian. They're holding you back. Jeremy stopped walking. I don't care. I'm not a solo act. Ian turned around when he realized he'd taken 5 steps alone. The window's light on the doors in the far end of the hallway created a silhouette around Jeremy's frame, shrouding his expression. Ian didn't care what this man thought or what claims he made. I'm not saying you would have to be a solo act. Jeremy held out his hands in resignation. We would hire a band to be your backup. Then you can hire my mates. Felt so obvious. I formed a band called Buxton Peak, and we are made up of Ian Taylor, Kai Burton, Andy Smith, and Gary Owens. Take it or leave it, but we are a package deal. Ian pivoted on his heel and walked back toward the band room. You're turning down the deal of a lifetime, Jeremy called after him. Ian didn't even hesitate, but as he opened the door, he glanced back at Jeremy. No, you are. We're in a unique predicament, Jeremy began, looking around the table at each of them in turn. I think you would all agree that taking your children out to bars and clubs would not be a viable option. 4 sets of parents nodded in agreement. The small meeting room off the main dining area of the restaurant was perfect for a group their size. Ian fiddled with his cloth napkin, wondering if he'd be brave enough to use it to wipe his mouth, or if he would just leave it in a flowerette sitting next to the crystal goblet filled with ice water. He realized he was slouching and pulled himself to a straight back, trying to seem businesslike. In reality, his heart was beating so fast he thought his mom could probably hear it from her place in the chair to his right. The other guys didn't seem as nervous. Ian looked over at Kai, whose maturity showed in his polite, confident smile. Ian needed some of that confidence. Gary's sullen expression and pursed lips couldn't hide the smirk he passed Ian. Andy's playful eyes danced behind his grin, and Ian couldn't help but return the smile. Just a kid along for the ride. He pulled their excitement across the table and his shoulders relaxed. They're going to eventually need to start playing shows, but for now it's more important to practice and lay down tracks for the songs they're writing. Jeremy reached for his glass, took a sip, and continued. They should also learn some cover songs. Until they gain a following, that's what the fans want to hear. We introduced the original tunes a little at a time in the beginning. Jeremy opened a leather binder and picked up an expensive-looking pen. Should we have an attorney at this meeting? Ian's dad sat back with his arms crossed and brow furrowed. Ian observed the change in posture and panicked that his dad was going to mess this up before they started. That was to be my next item of business, Jeremy said. You will want representation, because I believe in mutually beneficial contracts. The parents glanced around the room at one another, and Ian bit his fingernail. Lawyers? Contracts? I just want to play music. The boys seem to think they've officially formed a band, Jeremy continued, tapping his pen lightly against the pad of paper on the table. There are some questions, however. Who has the right to the name Buxton Peak? Who has the rights to the songs? From what I've seen in the limited amount of time I've been watching these boys, Ian writes all the songs, yet uses the collective we to describe their music. I know that's a touchy subject, but those things need to be decided now to avoid legal challenges later. Ian gulped and glanced back and forth between Kai, Andy, and Gary. Their grins had left their faces, and there was an almost suspicious air in the room. Ian shrank back into his seat. The guys were yet unaware of the handshake agreements already in place. Like I said, we're in a unique predicament in that we're catching all this from square one. Jeremy glanced over at Mr. Hayworth and nodded, passing the authoritative baton. Jeremy's right. Mr. Hayworth took a deep breath, sat forward, peering over his glasses at the parents, avoiding eye contact with his 4 students. He reached for a little pitcher of cream and poured a dollop into his coffee. Most musical groups don't have trained professionals watching their every move like these kids. Most groups play together for months and usually years, in a garage or basement, jamming, writing, performing, and then they get noticed by professionals. It's to their benefit that I've been privy to Ian's talent since he was very young. Kai's eyebrows creased and he sat back in his chair. Andy shrugged his shoulders and Gary frowned. Helen Owens interrupted. My son Gary has been playing drums and taking lessons since he was a little boy, long before he came to this high school." "You're right, Mrs. Owens," Mr. Hayworth nodded. "I was very impressed with him from the day he stepped into my band room. But he's not writing the music." Helen sat back and folded her arms, pursing her lips and looking over into the far corner. Gary picked at his cuticle and wouldn't meet Ian's gaze. "Herein lies the challenge," Jeremy cut back into the conversation. "This all needs to be decided before we go any further. I have some suggestions on how to draw up contracts for things like this, but I'm not sure I've ever been in a situation where I've seen such definitive proof of ownership rights." "Ownership rights?" Ian thought. "What does that mean?" "I tell the guys what to play and how to play it, and they play the chords, hold the rhythms, tat out the beats. Does that mean I own the music? Is that even possible?" Unfortunately, a 15-year-old can't legally enter into a contract. That, coupled with Ian's continued use of the collective when referring to the band, is why I invited all 4 sets of parents to join me this evening. If we can agree on some terms, start making long-term plans, including escape clauses so everyone feels represented, I think we're on the right track. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" John Burton put his arm around Kai's shoulder in support of his son. "That our boys have enough talent that you are willing to represent them before they've even played a show?" Ian's head whipped back over toward Jeremy and their eyes met. Ian knew what Jeremy's true feelings were on the subject of talent. He hoped his piercing gaze spoke to Jeremy's conscience. "Lie if you have to. Don't mess this up." "Well, that would be drawn into the contract," Jeremy explained. "I want them to have representation before they get that far so they can hit the ground running, so to speak. But yes, there is a great deal of talent in this room." "Good save," Ian thought. Shoulders relaxed around the table. The parents glanced at one another, small smiles showing here and there, with some skepticism, some suspicion, but all ears were open to Jeremy's ideas. Ian gulped. "Is this really happening?" he thought. "Here's where I see this going," Jeremy said. "The guys will continue as they are, writing, practicing, recording, and learning the music business. Then, when they're ready, maybe a year or 2, they begin playing locally at small venues, such as a community theater or a small stadium." "Stadium?" Ian spoke for the first time that evening. "Like with people paying money to get in?" Most of the adults in the room chuckled. "Duh," Kai said. "That's the idea." The corner of Ian's mouth lifted in response to his best friend's gleaming eyes. They raised their eyebrows at each other. "Do you think people will actually come to hear us play?" Andy asked. "I've been in this business a long time," Jeremy said. "I wouldn't be sitting at this table right now if I didn't think you had what it takes." "And I wouldn't have called Mr. Walker had I not thought the same." Mr. Hayworth looked around the table at each of the boys in turn. "But it's going to take hard work and determination. Do you think you can handle that?" Ian and the other guys echoed one another's nods of affirmation. At that point, the 2 waitresses who had been assigned to their table came around with salad and breadsticks, and conversation evolved to other topics. Ian sat back and watched the adults discuss the arrangement. His mind was elsewhere, on a stage, in front of thousands, playing music he'd created. Ian kept glancing at the other guys with knowing smirks and nodding heads. Let the adults work out the logistics. Let's rock. "So what? Ian's just going to own all of our music and our name?" Kai was bouncing a small rubber ball against the back wall of the band room, pouting. Ian was still dumbfounded about the results of the previous night's meeting. "That's what the adults agreed upon," Mr. Hayworth explained. He turned a chair around so he was straddling it and leaning against the back. He raised his eyebrows and craned his neck to try to get Kai to look at him. "You will all still get paid every time one of those songs are played on the radio, or a digital copy is downloaded, or a CD is sold, for the rest of your lives. But yes, Ian will own the rights to them." "So Ian can just kick us out of the band anytime he wants?" Andy glared at Ian as if he expected that to happen today. Ian decided to keep his mouth shut and let Mr. Hayworth do the explaining. They needed to get past this so they could go forward. Ian was determined to be patient with his frustrated mates. He wanted them kept in the dark about the real reason behind the arrangements. Theoretically, yes, Mr. Hayworth gulped. I can't do this without you, Ian said. Oops, so much for being patient, he thought. Yeah, you can. Kai twisted and tossed the ball right at Ian. His eyes were hard and full of fire, but his shoulders slouched in resignation. You don't need us. I need you. Ian's nonverbal communication included the tiniest nod. He was glad he hadn't said the words out loud, but he could tell from the slight movement of Kai's eyebrows that he understood. The other guys, yeah, he could probably replace Gary and Andy, but Buxton Peak included Kai Burton and Ian Taylor. Ian whispered under his breath, Joe Perry. Steven Tyler, Kai whispered back. Ian was pretty sure no one else would understand the reference. The American classic rock band Aerosmith had proven their lead singer and songwriter, Steven Tyler, wasn't complete without his right-hand man, guitar player Joe Perry. When the band tried to go their separate ways, nothing was the same. The dynamic was gone. Once they pulled the two of them back together, the magic returned. Ian tossed the ball back to Kai and a volley began. Gradually, Kai's expression softened, and after several lobs, he whipped the ball at Ian and grinned. It bounced off Ian's chest and hit the bass drum. Oh, now it's on. Ian dashed across the room to retrieve the ball and chucked it back at Kai. He ducked, but Gary retrieved it and threw it at Ian. That time, Ian caught the ball and lobbed it over to Andy, who tossed it to Kai, who created an elaborate arc through the air. The ball landed in Gary's hands. So the passes continued for a few moments until they were all smiling and laughing. Eventually, Ian stopped the game and gathered his pals around him. They brought their heads together and wrapped their arms around each other's shoulders. Guys, we're going to make history together. We're going to be epic, Kai said. I support you, Ian, Andy added. No, Ian stopped him. We support each other. I don't care what those contracts say. This, right here, this is Buxton Peak. We are Buxton Peak. We're brothers, best mates. We're going to be a rock band together. Let's rock, Gary said emphatically. Let's rock, Ian, Kai, and Andy echoed. They broke apart their group hug, pushing and shoving each other like brothers do. All right, Mr. Hayworth stood and clapped his hands together once. Let's lay down some tracks. Their teacher went into the sound booth, and each student picked up an instrument, ready to go to work. All right, that was the end of the chapter, Buxton Peak, the Early Years. If you're liking these video series, I hope that you will give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel and share these videos on social media so others can appreciate them as well. Have a good one.